Well, welcome everyone to the Charter for Compassion's EdNet Forum. Today we are pleased to welcome Andrew Garner, physician, pediatrician, author, and avid child advocate to be with us today to tell us about his wonderful and most significant work. But before I give a more formal introduction to Dr. Garner, traditionally we take 3 minutes of silent meditation. And so I would just invite you all to maybe close your eyes, take a relaxed and upright position, and find that area of your body that is pleasant. Certainly avoid an uncomfortable area, and simply would invite you to take 3 short breaths, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, and breathing out. And as thoughts come, let them come and let them go. And simply bring your attention back to your breath during the next 3 minutes. So we will take the 3 in silent meditation. And now I'd invite you to bring your attention back to your breath, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in and breathing out. And at the sound of the bell, you can return to the room and open your eyes. And thank you all for that time of silence and meditation. In our busy world, we need to spend more time in silent meditation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and a colleague, Dr. Andrew Garner. And I know Andy to be a very relational person. And so I'm first going to say that when he's not involved in the depths of his pediatric practice, he loves to spend quality time with his wife, his 2 adult children, and their family dog, Bear. So he loves to hike and fish, and he loves watching baseball. Go Braves. Yeah, right. Dr. Andrew Garner is a pediatrician. He's author, and he is a definite child advocate. He's a graduate of Swarthmore College. He graduated with a BA with distinction in psychobiology. He's a medical scientist. He both studied medicine and received a PhD in neuroscience in a training program at Case Western Reserve University. And he did his pediatric residency training program at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, a most excellent institution. Dr. Garner has practiced primary care pediatrics at the University Hospitals of Cleveland for more than 20 years. He's a clinical professor of pediatrics at Case Western Reserve. He has co-authored the American Academy of Pediatrics 2 policy statements. He served as president of that organization. And these policies have included childhood toxic stress. And he has authored a book entitled Thinking Developmentally, Nurturing Wellness in Childhood to Promote Lifelong Health. It gives me great pleasure to turn things over to you, Dr. Garner, and we look forward to what you have to share with us.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Let me just begin by making sure I can share my screen here. I was telling Dr. Barker before, there was one time I gave a seminar, and the entire talk, I was talking, thinking they could see my slides, and they couldn't. And so that made for a very, very boring presentation for the rest of you. So I want to make sure everything goes to plan here. Let's make sure it's working here. Come on. There we go. Does that work for everybody?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Barker. Let me just correct one thing. I was president of the Ohio chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Haven't been president of the entire organization yet. So, but I appreciate the introduction, and even more so, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I'm also particularly grateful for all of you joining us on a Monday morning. I'd like to begin with a bit of a confession, and that is that while I certainly have no professional training as a theologian of any sort, I like to think of myself as an amateur theologian by marriage. I have a wife that's an ordained elder in the Methodist Church, and many years ago, she took me to Chautauqua Institute to hear Karen Armstrong speak on violence and religion. And it's amazing to me, you know, back then, that was maybe 8-10 years ago, professionally, I was obsessed with this idea of toxic stress, of childhood toxic stress. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that today, because toxic stress helps us understand how experiences in childhood are basically development. They sort of are biologically embedded, right? How these experiences can impact sort of life course trajectories. It doesn't mean it's destiny, but they have a strong association with what happens down the line. And so in many ways, that's what I'm going to talk about today. But in just a few years since then, in the last 8 years or so, developmental science has advanced even further. And it's helping us understand that it's not only the adversity that can become biologically embedded, it's also the nurturing experiences, the positive childhood experiences, the experiences that are afforded by safe, stable, nurturing relationships, one might say from compassionate relationships. Those also buffer adversity and are biologically embedded and promote resilience down the line. And then the implications for all this science, right, are innumerable, right? I mean, they have incredible indications for medicine, for education, for public policy, and how we as a society or as a species support families with young children, and how we raise a generation that is really appalled by violence and not seduced by that type of violence we saw this weekend in Buffalo and Laguna and Texas. And so clearly I have a lot to say. And so the good Dr. Barker suggested I give 2 talks. So the first one is really going to focus on the science of development and concepts of toxic stress and relational health. And then the second talk in a few weeks, I'll begin to parse out a few of the numerous implications of the science and how we have to start translating what we know into actually what we do. And then I'll program some brief redundancy into the beginning of the second talk so that everyone's on the same page, even if you weren't able to attend the talk today. So I have some 3 learning objectives here for today. The first is to briefly describe the adverse childhood experiences study If you're familiar with it, that's great. If not, don't worry about it. One of my colleagues like to say it's probably the most important study you've probably never heard of. And you can see here it's been out for 20 some years, but I'll talk about that. And then I'm going to define this idea of toxic stress and describe how it helps elucidate what I think of as the problem, and then define relational health and describe how it helps to elucidate the solution. So when I mentioned Dr. Barker, I get really excited talking about this stuff. And when I get excited, I tend to talk really fast. One of some feedback I got several years ago when I gave grand rounds at an institution, and they gave me the feedback from the listeners afterwards. And one of the listeners said that listening to Dr. Garner is like trying to take a sip from a fire hose. And I don't think they meant that in a positive way. I think they said, I had too much information, right? And so one way to try and help that is I'm going to try and slow down. The other is I'm going to try and give you a roadmap of where I'm going, because I think that helps a little bit. And so I tapped into my sort of David Letterman and came up not with a top 10 list, but a top 8 list of critical concepts I'm going to try and cover today. The first is the title of the talk, right? What happens in childhood does not stay in childhood. The second is you cannot define adversity solely on the basis of the event itself or the precipitant of the trigger. An objective measure, though, is the body stress response. So if we start looking at the responses, we get more objective measures of adversity. Childhood experiences change the way your genes work. They also change the way your brain forms originally, and then how it functions going on, because the brain has that plasticity, can literally rewire itself in response to experiences. And it's not this old paradigm of nature versus nurture, but it's actually nurture dancing with nature. And resilience is actually a manifestation of skills. And that's important because those are skills that can be learned, they can be taught, they can be modeled, they can be celebrated. And that relational health, as manifest by the formation and maintenance of safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, that provides the positive childhood experiences that are the antidote to adverse childhood experiences. They're the antidote to toxic stress responses. And in many ways, they're the answer to many long-term, seemingly intractable problems. So the first of my critical concepts then is the title is what happens in childhood does not stay in childhood. And another way to sort of rephrase that is that life course science tells us that experiences in childhood, both positive and adverse, are strongly associated with behaviors, health, and economic productivity decades later. And the adverse childhood experiences study, the tale of the ACEs, is just one example of that. So I mentioned before, again, it's been around for 20 some years, but it's only now sort of making its way into medical practice, which is something we've known for a long time, is that they talk about the gap between the bench and the bedside. The things that advance in science don't usually make it to what we actually do until later. And I think that's particularly true when the science is sort of changing the status quo and challenging us to think about things in a different way. And the adverse childhood experiences study certainly falls into that category. So I'd like to tell you a little bit of the tale of the ACE study. So it started actually way back in the 1990s when Dr. Flitti, who's actually an internist, was practicing in Southern California in the San Diego area. And he was running an adult obesity clinic. Like, what does that have to do with childhood adversity? Well, we'll get there. So what he had a problem, and that was that all of his superstars, we're talking to people that were morbidly obese, that lost hundreds of pounds, invariably were the ones that rebounded. So as soon as he was able to work with them and get them to lose weight, they would put it right back on again. And he couldn't figure out what was going on. And so he decided to start from the very beginning. And he actually took a standardized social work interview of these patients. And in doing that, he uncovered lots of adversity in childhood, being sexually abused, being neglected, having parents that were abusive. And he just could not believe that there was all this adversity in childhood, and could that somehow be related to what these patients were going through. So he then asked his colleagues to do the same, and they found a similar outrageously high level of adversity. So he took this data to Robert Anda, who's a epidemiologist at the CDC, and that's when the ACE study was born. And the results were published again in 1998. And what they looked at were, and again, this is a retrospective study. So they were looking at mainly adults in their 50s, mainly middle class, many college educated. It's not a population you would think that would necessarily be associated with having significant adversity. and they asked them about 10 different categories of adversity. They looked at 3 categories of abuse: emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, 5 measures of household dysfunction: a mother being treated violently, household substance abuse, household mental illness, parental separation or divorce, an incarcerated household member, and then 2 measures of neglect. And what they found, and this is over 17,000, again, middle-class, middle-aged adults, they found very, very large numbers of abuse, right? So if you look at this, 1 in 4 had physical abuse or household substance abuse before the age of 18. And about 1 in 5 had experienced sexual abuse, household mental illness, or parental separation or divorce, again, before their 18th birthday. And so when this first came out, there was a lot of pushback from the medical community. This can't be true. This is an unusual population. And subsequent studies have shown that it actually is very true. And it depends on the population you look at. These ACEs are actually overrepresented. So if you look, for example, at people that are incarcerated, they have much higher levels of adverse childhood experiences. So they wanted to try and quantify this adversity. And so what they decided was to give each patient an ACE score, where you got 1 point for each one of these different categories. So I love the ACE study. I think it's important for people to understand, but I think it's also important to recognize that the ACE score actually underrepresents true adversity for many reasons. First of all, there are other types of adversity other than these, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second. But even more than that, this is a retrospective study, so we know there's issues with recall. So adults are less likely to remember adverse events. We try and suppress those thoughts, and so that underrepresents the adversity. And there's issues with repetition. So if you were physically assaulted once versus every day for a year, it's still just 1 point. And there's issues with redundancy. So if you look, say, at household substance abuse, so if your mom preferred crack cocaine, but your dad was a heroin addict, it's still just 1 point, right? So the point is the ACE score underrepresents adversity, but nevertheless, they were able to show a statistically significant dose-dependent effect. So the higher your ACE score, the higher all of these outcomes. And so this slide, I know it looks overwhelming, all these ripple effects from ACEs, right? So you've got smoking, you got alcoholism, you got issues with sexuality, you got issues with general functioning, and it can be really sort of overwhelming, right? And if you look at these, some of these are some of the things we're actually struggling with as a society in terms of dealing with mental illness and ischemic heart disease and cancer. But see, when I look at this screen, though, I see potential, right? I see possibilities, because if we can understand how ACEs are biologically impacting all these outcomes, we have the potential to make a big difference. And it gets even more promising if you look at these big 5. And I know I circled 6, I really can count, but I'm sort of lumping in illicit drugs and IV drugs to just substance abuse. So what do smoking, alcoholism, promiscuity, obesity, and substance abuse have in common? The physiologists would tell us they're examples of behavioral allostasis. So let's unpack that a little bit. What do we mean by that? Well, there's this concept in physiology called homeostasis, right? So the body likes to maintain itself in a certain range. So for example, your temperature can't get too high, or you get, you have hyperthermia, and your sodium level can't get too low, or you have seizures. And so there is an active process called allostasis that brings things back to normal. So when the environment pushes you, allostasis pushes back to bring things back to normal. It's an active process. And when we talk about behavioral allostasis, we're talking about behaviors that people do to turn off stress. So think about it that way, right? Smoking, alcoholism, promiscuity. If you say obesity is a marker for overeating, we do those things for a reason. In the short term, they turn off stress. They're actually somewhat beneficial in that they turn off the stress response, but obviously in the long run, they're health harming, right? And then think about how these 5 things impact all the other ones. So if you smoke, what's going to increase your risk of lung disease, right? And if you're an alcoholic, it's going to increase your risk of liver disease. If you're promiscuous, it's going to have issues with sexual health. If you have issues with substance abuse, we know that impacts your health and general functioning. So again, we really want to try and sort of understand how are these experiences becoming sort of biologically embedded and impacting outcomes decades down the line. And there's lots of other studies that go along with this. If you think about sort of the time course here, whether or not it's a retrospective study like the ACE study and other epidemiologic studies where they're looking backwards, or whether it's a prospective study where they're looking forwards, they do an intervention, they see the outcome, the timeline is the same. There's a childhood experience. There's that proverbial big black box with a whole bunch of biological mechanisms going on in the inside. And then you've got these adult outcomes on the other side. And on the adversity side of things, we tend to think about the adverse childhood experiences, but there's a problem with that because, of course, adversity is not always violence, abuse, and disasters, right? Adversity can also be poverty, racism, and social isolation, right? And we know all those sort of adverse experiences, they are associated with poor health, academic failure, and economic hardship down the line. But as I mentioned before, that's only half the story, right? We know that there are positive childhood experiences where you have attuned adults, you have opportunities for developmentally appropriate play. And a good example I like to raise up is Reach Out and Read, which is a program where pediatricians and others focus on shared reading. We know that all of those types of experiences are associated with healthy lifestyles, academic success, and economic stability. So not the $1 million, not the $1 billion, literally the $1 trillion question is what's going on inside this box? Because if we can understand that biology, we're in a lot better position to not only promote the good stuff, but prevent the bad stuff. And again, these are just associations. This is not destiny. An ACE score is not your destiny. And because we know that there are some children who have every possible material advantage yet do poorly. And we say, well, they were difficult or they were doomed, or it was just their temperament. And then conversely, there are kids that have tremendous adversity that they do relatively well and say, oh, well, they were just resilient, right? And so again, it's not destiny, but if we can begin to parse out the mechanisms underlying what happens in the first 18 years, and then what happens down the line, we're in a better position to promote the good stuff and prevent the bad stuff. All right, so critical concept number 2, you cannot define or measure adversity or stress on the basis of the events themselves, right? We know that adversity and stress are extremely subjective. So one child will hear a dog barking and think, oh, puppy, let's play. And another is like terrified, right? And so some of that has to do with their previous experiences. But the point is, you're going to have a hard time wrapping your hands around and measuring and defining adversity if you're looking at the event itself, because that is it's how we interpret the event and how we understand the event. And that actually is an important part of trauma-based care, is the narrative, how people attribute what happened helps in the healing. But it's even more complicated than that because there's a spectrum of adversity. And I alluded to this before, that we tend to think of adversity as being discrete threatening events like abuse or bullying or terrorism. But we all know there's a spectrum that goes all the way towards ongoing chronic conditions. And in between, we have this whole spectrum of what we think of as the social determinants of health. These are things that are socially defined in your environment that impact your health outcomes, from abuse, violence, bullying, parental substance abuse, parental mental illness, racism, poverty, neglect. And they all trigger a physiologic stress response. And that's something that's more objective, something we can measure, we can get our hands around. And we tend to sort of acknowledge that those that are experiencing those discrete threatening events, they're clearly at high risk for a toxic stress response. And I'll talk about what toxic stress is in a second. But we have to acknowledge that the largest number of people that are at risk for a toxic stress response are actually those children that are growing up in poverty, neglect, and exposure to racism. That's a large number. Epidemiologically, we know that. But all of these have another thing in common. In addition to triggering a stress response, they also make it way more difficult to form safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, right? Hurt people tend to hurt people. And they're all bad for the human condition, right? We know that social isolation and loneliness are just bad for the human condition. And there's actually a very interesting study by Matthew Pantel that sort of did the same sort of an ACE study, but instead of the ACE score, it was a social isolation score. The more socially isolated you are, the worse you did, right? And even Felitti says that he thinks the real message behind the ACE study is that socialization is bad. When kids experience adversity, they tend to feel isolated, like they have a secret, like if people knew what happened to them, they wouldn't love them anymore. And so that social isolation is really, really toxic for the human condition. All right, so critical concept number 3 then, an objective measure of adversity is the body's stress response, right? So now we're not looking at the precipitant, the event, but the response, right? And a corollary to that is not all stress is bad stress, right? And so Jack Shonkoff and several colleagues, there's a National Scientific Council on Developing Child. And over a decade ago, they came up with sort of this taxonomy of stress, 3 different kinds of stress. There's toxic stress, there's tolerable stress, and there's positive stress. And I'm just going to focus on the 2 extremes at the moment. So positive stress response is brief, infrequent, or mild to moderate intensity. So there's a stressor and you come back to normal pretty quickly. And that's what kids experience every day in their lives, right? So a 15-month-old who can't express their desires, a 2-year-old who sort of does a face plant while running, beginning school or childcare, or even a big project in middle school. These are all events that could trigger a stress response. But if they're safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, they allow that stress response to be brief and mild and infrequent, right? So we're going to respond to nonverbal cues of the 15-month-old. We're going to offer consolation to the 2-year-old who fell. We're going to offer reassurance for coming back at the end of the day to the child care child. And we're going to help that middle schooler break up that big assignment into little bits to help with planning and assistance. The point is that positive stress responses can build confidence and resilience in the future. We're literally teaching you how to cope with that displeasure, that distress. But this is the other thing then. Positive stress is not the absence of stress. Our objective is not to put kids into a bubble. It's not like putting Buddha, right, in the prison. It's not to prevent the absence of stress, right? We actually want to give them the skills to cope with stress, right? All right. So then the other end of the spectrum, right, is toxic stress. What's a toxic stress response? It's longer lasting, it's more frequent, it's stronger in intensity, and you can see how the adverse child experiences could precipitate that sort of a response. There's insufficient social emotional buffering. There's not enough support to turn off that stress response. And so kids are basically being bathed in these physiologic mediators of stress. We know that cortisol and epinephrine, these are what happen when your body is threatened. And as a consequence of being exposed to those mediators, there are potentially permanent changes, right? This is how adversity become biologically embedded. And so we know it can happen at least in 3 different ways. It can happen at the molecular level in epigenetics. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. It can happen at the cellular level in terms of how the brain gets wired and the connections that the brain's making. And it can happen at the behavioral level. We already mentioned the idea of behavioral allostasis. In fact, you know, one of the really insightful participants in the original ACE study said, you know, doc, it's hard to get enough of something that almost works, right? All those behaviors almost work. And so it's easy to get addicted to them, but they don't necessarily fix everything. And so you come back to them again, and now you're trapped in this vicious cycle of trying to cope in an unhealthy way. So one of the take-home messages from today, though, is that all the same biology that underlies how adversity becomes biologically embedded, we're increasingly realizing that's the same biology that explains how relational health becomes biologically embedded. So let me just sort of define what I mean by relational health. So relational health refers to the ability to develop and sustain safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And these in turn afford kids with those positive childhood experiences that help them adapt in a healthy manner. So this relational health, of course, occurs in many ecological circles, right? We tend, as a pediatrician, I tend to think about it at the dyadic level, right? Where they got a parent or a caregiver and their child and the interactions that they have. But they're also, relational health also refers to what happens at the familial level, right? Their interfamilial interactions. And it also happens at the community and societal levels in terms of what we consider normative behaviors. And so an example of this, I think, again, is shared reading, right? If we're spending a lot of time reading with our kids, you know, if that becomes just sort of what we do, then that's going to promote our relational health with our children. Relational health also happens at a provider level. So whether or not you're a pediatric provider, or you're an educator, or you're a social worker, or whatever professional hat you have, the way you interact with parents and clients and families, there's a relational health that happens there. And then it also happens at the practice level in terms of how professions interact with each other. The point here is, though, that relational health buffers adversity. And so you may have seen there when I mentioned the definition of toxic stress happens in the absence of the social emotional buffers. It happens in the absence of relational health. And as a consequence, the stress response is a toxic one. But with those buffers, the toxic stress can become tolerable or even positive. And relational health builds the skills needed to be resilient in the future. And that really was the take-home message from the most recent American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement on toxic stress, is that relational health is the antidote. And I'm going to talk more about those in a little bit. All right, so critical concept number 4 then, childhood experiences change the way your genes work, right? And so this is getting us into this realm of epigenetics, where you may have heard a lot of. The phrase epigenetics literally means above the genome and refers to changes in gene expression, but no changes in the DNA sequence. So we're not actually changing your DNA sequence, but we're changing which parts of the sequence get turned on and get turned off, right? And so this is part of a much larger revolution in genomic science that's happening right now. We used to think that your genome was static, right? It was fixed, right? And there are some diseases that are like that. Some of you may be familiar with the disease called Huntington's disease, where if you inherit this gene, we know it's very, very likely when you end up in your 50s that things aren't going to go so well. But that's actually the minority of genes. The new view is that the genome is actually relatively plastic, right? That it's incredibly responsive to environmental input. And so the experts say, think about the genome as a very, very complex set of switches, right? So some of these switches are master switches, and we know that happens in development. So if you turn on this particular gene, you get an arm that grows here, or you turn on this particular gene and you get an organ that grows here. And so we know that some genes are master switches. Now, other genes are very dynamic, and that makes sense too. So we know we have circadian rhythms, genes get turned on, genes get turned off over time. But here's the kicker. There are some genes that are programmed very early and they're stable. And I'm sorry, stable. They are very stable. They are maintained over time. And so this has led to an aphorism you may have heard at some point, where the genes load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. And so obviously the American Academy of Pediatrics prefers a less violent analogy. And so they've endorsed this idea that epigenetics, not your parents' genome. The idea being that you may inherit, sets of genes from both of your parents, but that's not your destiny. Because, for example, if you inherit a gene that makes it very likely you're going to become an alcoholic, but the environment never turns on that gene, then it's not so much of a risk anymore, right? And so this is actually really, really good news that we have more control over our genome than we may have once thought. Now, I'm going to give you an example of epigenetics, but before I do, I want to make it clear I am not picking on pregnant mothers. I'm not. I'm giving you just an example of how what can happen early on how epigenetics can explain how experiences early on, even prenatal, can impact outcomes later down the line. So we know that there's significant maternal distress in the last trimester of pregnancy. We know that can lead to the methylation of the fetus's glucocorticoid receptor. So why is that important? Well, I mentioned before that cortisol is an important stress hormone, and it is regulated very tightly, because too much cortisol is bad for you and too little cortisol is bad for you. And so one of the feedback loops is when cortisol levels get too high, the glucocorticoid receptor in the brain says, hey, we got enough here, we're going to shut that down, right? So it's part of a break. But if you methylate the fetus's glucocorticoid receptor, you don't get as much receptor. And we know that from studies that you decrease the expression of the glucocorticoid receptor in the brain, which means you've released the brake, and now you have more toxic stress, more cortisol, right? So you can see how this early adversity, even antenatally, can lead to a vicious cycle of toxic stress. Now, a couple things about that. One is you could say, well, that's adaptive initially, right? It may be preparing the fetus for a dog-eat-dog world, right? It's nasty out there. You got to get your game on. You got to be able to scream and get some attention, or you're not going to get what you need. On the other hand, in the long term, that could be health harming if it means that you got a particularly hard to console, really fussy, colicky baby that may impair the attachment with the mother, right? And so everything comes with the cost. The good news, and then let me make it clear, I'm not picking on moms. I'm seeing this as an example of how, as a society, we should do a better job of supporting moms in the last trimester of pregnancy, making sure that they have their needs met, right? And the really, really good news is, like I said, relational health is giving us some hints that this is reversible. So these methylation patterns, like I said, they're programmed early, but they're not necessarily fixed in the sense that we know that opportunities for relational health in the form of breastfeeding, in the form of nurturing touch, can actually reverse some of those methylation patterns, right? So toxic stress helps us understand how adversity can become embedded via epigenetic mechanisms, but relational health shows us how we can reverse those same epigenetic mechanisms. All right, critical concept number 5. Childhood experiences change the way your brain forms and functions. So this is what my graduate work was in neuroscience. Brain connectivity across the board, it's experience dependent, right? So there is a genetic blueprint that gives us a basic structure, but the formation and maintenance of individual connections or synapses and complex circuits or connections that form from those synapses, they're all dependent upon activity. And the activity is dependent upon the experience. What's happening around the child is translated into activity in the brain. So the ecologies, the environmental experiences influence both how the architecture of the brain is formed initially, and then also how it's remodeled over time. When we talk about remodeling, we're talking about plasticity. And I'm not going to go into the weeds in terms of different types of plasticity, but we know that cellular plasticity diminishes over time, right? And so it gets a lot harder to change things. It's harder to teach an old dog new tricks. And so we got to get things right the first time. We also know that different parts of the brain mature at different rates and sort of come online at different times. So that process, differential maturation of the brain plus significant adversity, can lead to yet another cycle of toxic stress. And I'll talk about that in a second. The point here is that early experiences create a potentially permanent alterations in the way the brain connectivity happens and functions over time. So again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but I want to just talk about a few structures. And the reason I'm introducing this now is I'm going to talk about it in the next talk about these 3 structures and how they interact. And so I want to talk about the prefrontal cortex, that's the PFC and the hippocampus, and the amygdala. And it's sort of like a seesaw. They're on opposite ends of the seesaw. So the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, they promote reflective, adaptive behaviors, but they're inhibited by the amygdala. The amygdala, on the other hand, promotes impulsive and aggressive behaviors, but it in turn is inhibited by the prefrontal cortex, right? And so the question is, who's calling the shots? Is it the amygdala or is it the prefrontal cortex? If it's the amygdala, impulsive, aggressive, prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, more reflective and more adaptive, right? Well, it turns out that when we're in survival mode, right, when we don't have those safe, stable, nurturing relationships, it's the amygdala that's calling the shots, right? And it's shutting down the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. And we all know this from our experience, right? If someone comes up and puts a gun to your head, and you're like, duh, I can't even talk. You literally can't access what your options are, right? So in the absence of safe, stable, nurturing relationships, when we're in survival mode, the amygdala is in charge and the behaviors tend to be more impulsive and aggressive. On the other hand, when we're in relational mode, when we have those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships around us, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are in charge, and they shut down the amygdala and they allow for more adaptive behaviors, right? Some people have said that the prefrontal cortex is the seat of civilization, right? It allows us to think abstractly and to make other choices. But here's the real kicker, right? The amygdala matures relatively early in development, which sort of makes sense, right? So, when you're young, it's better to shoot first and ask questions later, or there may not be a tomorrow. But as we get older, we obviously want to be able to adapt. And the problem, though, is the prefrontal cortex is the very, very last structure to mature structurally. So if you look at the myelination, the prefrontal cortex, it's not complete until the mid-20s. Which on one hand is good news. It's never too late for kids, right? There's never too late to give up on adolescence. There's always opportunities for hope and for change. But this differential maturation with the sort of the on switch, the amygdala is thought of as being the on switch for the stress response, that maturing earlier than the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, which helps turn off the stress response, you can see how adversity in childhood can lead to another vicious cycle. So we have childhood distress, because of the differential maturation of the brain, the amygdala is screaming and the prefrontal cortex still finding its voice. And so we have more of a stress response, and those changes lead to changes in connectivity in the brain. So we know, for example, kids that grow up in Romanian orphanages where there's a lot of toxic stress, there's not a lot of social interaction, their amygdalas are literally bigger, they're larger and more active, which can lead to hyper-responsiveness and harder to calm and another vicious cycle of toxic stress. But the good news here as well, this is not destiny, right? We know that if we have interventions, there's an intervention called attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, we know that if we have those sorts of interventions, we can change activity in the brain. So if you look at EEG patterns, you can pick out which kids have significant adversity, and then you can also pick out which kids have been in these programs, which will normalize their EEG pattern. So again, toxic stress helps us understand how adversity can become biologically embedded in the development of the brain, but relational health helps us understand how it can be reversed. So that leads us to the next slide. Toxic stress and relational health are really sort of two sides of the same coin. So again, at the molecular level, we can look at DNA methylation patterns, and adversity increases the methylation. At the cellular level, we can look at EEG patterns. At the behavioral level, we're going to look at those measures of behavioral allostasis. But relational health in the form of breastfeeding and touch decreases the methylation, and EEG patterns normalize, and relational health builds adversity and promotes the skills needed for resilience. So I'm going to delve more into what I mean by resilience in a second. But before I go there, I want to just briefly step back a second again. So the take home from this slide, though, is that if toxic stress is the problem, relational health is the solution. Now, before I discuss resilience, though, I just want to step back for a second and say, sort of summarize what developmental science is telling us, right? It's telling us that be it adaptive or maladaptive development is the result of an ongoing but cumulative, and that's important, cumulative, because that means what happens early has impacts for what happens down the line, an ongoing but cumulative dance between the ecology and the biology. And so this has led to a different model. So those of you that may be familiar, a lot of medicines originally was based on sort of a reductionist biomedical model, which is, that one gene, one bug causes problems. And it wasn't really until the 1970s that we came up with this biopsychosocial, which actually sort of gave at least a little tint of the hat to the social impact of health. And the American Academy of Pediatrics now has embraced this idea of an eco-biodevelopmental model, because it sort of summarizes all what we just talked about. So the ecology, the physical, nutritional, and the psychosocial milieu through epigenetics and through neuroscience, it becomes biologically embedded, right? It changes genomic function, physiology, brain function, and the output of all biology essentially is behavior, right? And so there's this ongoing dance between the ecology and biology, because the behavior then changes the ecology, which changes the next experience, right? So there's this dance going on back and forth, but the cumulative part adds a dimension of time. So there are changes that are occurring at the molecular cellular levels, and those changes, be it adaptive or maladaptive, depends on the context, right? So again, for example, let's say there's, we'll take the example we took of the infant whose mother was particularly distressed. Now we've got methylation patterns that are increasing, a very jittery, colicky baby. That may make sure that kid gets fed, but it may impair the attachment. And similarly, as the brain begins to develop, as a child's developing, are we nurturing the experiences that are promoting relationships and the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus and the thinking learning brain, or are we actually nurturing the development of the amygdala? So a couple of take homes then from this model, right? Clearly, we need to get the ecology right. We need fewer adverse childhood experiences and more positive childhood experiences. That changes the way we practice in medicine and education. And it really leads to another form of advocacy. So if you're someone like myself who spends a lot of time advocating for kids, there's sort of two models that have been out there. The first is sort of the ethical moral model, which is, you really need to do right by kids. It's sort of unethical to punish the kids for the parents, and it's just unethical to do harm to kids. So that's sort of one sort of model, but I'm not a lawyer or an ethicist. And then there's an economic argument that's very good too. So if you look at the work of James Heckman, another Nobel Prize winning economist, they'll say, well, that's a really good investment economically, that pays off in the long run. But there's a biological advocacy to be made here. Biologically, it's the right thing to do to make sure kids have those positive childhood experiences. Another important distinction with this model is there's no sort of artificial difference between physical and mental wellness. It's just, we got to get rid of the stigma that goes along with mental health. It's just adaptation. We are here as a species because we're really good at adapting. The question is, are we adapting in a healthy way or adapting in a maladaptive way over the long term? Many chronic conditions, the so-called non-communicable diseases, things like diabetes and cancer and lung disease and heart disease, they're adult manifest diseases with their origins in childhood. And so we want to, if we really want to get things right, we want to try and go upstream and address these childhood issues. Finally, it helps us ground sort of vague terms like what's adversity, what's resilience in the biology of stress, right? So adversity I talked about, it's going to trigger a physiologic stress response, and resilience is the ability to adapt to that response in a healthy manner. So let's talk a little bit about that. Resilience, right? Resilience is the ability to adapt to adversity in a healthy manner, and it manifests a set of skills. And this is really important because when you start talking about skills, we're talking about learning, right? So if a child has trouble with their math, we don't say, sucks to be you. We actually sit down and we build those skills. We work with them. We nurture, we celebrate when they have accomplished things. But if someone has trouble with their emotions, we pretty much say, here's your prison cell, right? Even though the way they respond is probably related to experiences they had before. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there is this collaborative for academic and social emotional learning, CASEL, and they define social emotional learning as the process through which children and adults understand and manage their emotions. That's self-awareness, right? Set and achieve positive goals. That's self-management. Feel and show empathy for others. Hello, that's compassion, right? Social awareness, and establish and maintain positive relationships and make responsible decisions. And these are skills we know that can be learned. And it doesn't mean that it's easier or hard, not easier or harder. We know some kids will have a harder time learning those skills, and other kids will have an easier time learning those skills, but they can be modeled, taught, practiced, reinforced, and celebrated by the safe, stable, nurturing relationships in a child's world. But it all starts with the idea of sort of self-awareness, right? Of being aware of your emotions. There's nothing wrong with strong emotions. It's knowing what to do about it. And again, that's something that those safe, stable, nurturing relationships can teach. Strong emotions are a normal part of being human. They're okay. The challenge is to be aware, normalize, and learn healthy adaptations. And so the way you can think about this, at least the way I talk about this in my practice for older children, is when you have a strong emotion, at least on the short term, you need a distraction. As adults, we understand that the way I feel now is not necessarily the way I'm going to feel tomorrow morning. It's going to pass. But in kids, they're just sort of stuck in that emotion. And so you need a distraction, at least in the short term. But the problem is there's three buckets, as I have here, three buckets of distractions. Some distractions are those behavioral allostasis things we talked about before, right? Tantrums, smoking. I mean, the reasons kids do that, they're distractions. They get away the stress in the short term, but in the long term, they cause problems. There also are sort of escapes. They're sort of distractions that are wastes of time, things like TVs and YouTube and video games. And kids love those because when you're doing them, they're not distressed anymore, but it's just sort of passive entertainment. It's not making you into a better person. And then there are healthy distractions, things like play and art and sports. And those are the things that are actually building resilience. And I am fully aware that that's part of the disparities that we're dealing with right now, right? That not all kids have opportunities to play and have opportunities for art and sports and to find their passions. But as if we want to help nurture the next generation, we want to make sure that we help them identify what their passions are. And again, this is sort of an implication. So I'm going to talk about more about this in the next talk, but I just wanted to help sort of give you an idea of what we mean by resilience. It's learning to adapt to adversity in a healthy way, putting that emotional energy into something that's constructive. All right. So again, the self-stable nurturing relationships help kids channel that emotional energy into something constructive. So concept number 8, we're almost there. I hope I haven't lost too many of you. So safe, stable, nurturing relationships are the antidote for toxic stress responses. And so I just want to give you some examples of that. So I mentioned before that relational health in the form of positive childhood experiences, they're going to buffer adversity and they're going to build skills. So what are some examples of that? I'm just going to give you a little bit of data here. Again, not get too much into the weeds, but one study that looks at the fact that it can buffer adversity, and another one is going to look at how we can build skills, right? So the first, and they both come from Christina Bethel, who's an epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins University. And this is a study they published where they looked at over 6,000 parents And they asked them as a child. So again, this is a retrospective thing where they're asking the parents what happened to them as a child if they had 7 positive childhood experiences. Did they feel they were able to talk about their feelings, felt their family stood by them in difficult times, enjoyed participating in community traditions, felt a sense of belonging in high school, felt supported by friends, had at least 2 non-parent adults who took an interest in them, and felt safe and protected by an adult in their home. And then they looked at measures of adult health, mental health functioning. So they said, have you ever been told by someone that you're depressed? Or in their own assessment, in the last 14 days, did they have more days where they felt their mental health was poor? And so what they found was, again, if you look on the y-axis here, this is increasing levels of poor mental health, of depression. And on the x-axis, we have increasing levels of positive childhood experiences. And you can see, as you have more of those positive experiences, the rates of depression go down. But then they also broke it up by adverse childhood experiences. And so that's the striking thing, is that the kids with the most adversity saw the most benefit from the positive childhood experiences. The point here is we have to promote those positive childhood experiences, particularly for those that are already dealing with adversity. So positive childhood experiences, that relational health, those safe, stable, nurturing relationships, they can buffer adversity. Again, adversity is not your destiny. What about the second assertion, though, that they actually help to build skills? So this is a much larger study that Christina Bethel and her colleagues did. They looked at 51,000 parents, and they asked them about their children, and they defined a child flourishing index. And so they asked the parents if their child was curious, completed things, and were in control. And in order to get a point, so the child flourishing index went from 0 to 3. And in order to get one of those points, it had to be definitely true that your kid was curious and was interested in learning things, was able to finish tasks, was able to stay calm and in control. Definitely true. That's a high bar, right? I mean, I have to admit, I'm not sure I meet those criteria on most days, right? So, so the point is, what this really is a measure of executive function. This is a measure of the prefrontal cortex. This is a measure of the ability to think abstractly and to plan and be curious and be in control. It's what we want for all of our kids. So they defined that as flourishing. And then they looked at a measure of family resilience and connection, which ranged from 0 to 6. And they said, when your family as a whole faces a problem, how often are you likely to work together, talk together, remind yourselves that you have strengths to draw on, and stay hopeful, and ask parents how well they share ideas or talk about things that really matter, and how well the parents are handling the day-to-day demands of raising children. What they found was, nationally, about 40% of kids are flourishing. Again, that seems like a relatively low number, that only 40% are flourishing. But again, it's a high bar. They're curious, they complete tasks, and they're in control when they're faced with a challenge. Definitely true. And then they broke it down by the family resilience and connection. So if there was relational health and they had that strong family resilience connection, more of those kids were flourishing. But here is the take home. This is the light bulb moment for me. They broke it down by ACEs, right? And so look here at the kids who have significant adversity, 4 to 9 ACEs, but they also have strong family resilience and connection. 30% of those kids were flourishing. But then look over here. These are kids that have an ACE score of 0, no ACEs, no adversity, but they had low family resilience and connection. Fewer of those were flourishing than kids that had high adversity. So high adversity and high family resilience did better than low adversity and no family resilience, which means we're basically, when we're talking about all ACE scores, we're missing half the equation, right? If we're only looking at the adversity, we're missing the point. All kids need relational health to flourish. And I think the problem here is that we tend to think about childhood experiences as being one axis, where we've got on the positive side, positive experiences, and on the negative side, adverse experiences. What this data is telling us, there are actually 2 different axes that interact to determine whether or not a child's going to be well or not. So on the positive side, or on the negative side of the adversity axis, you have more ACEs. And on the positive side, you have fewer ACEs. But then we also have a positive experience axis, where there are few positive experiences and many positive experiences. And they both then map onto a different axis, which is wellness. obviously, more ACEs, fewer positive childhood experiences, the less well you do, and the more positive experiences and the fewer ACEs, the more well you do. So this is really important though, because if we're just looking at a child's ACE score, we're just looking at the adversity, we might predict that they would fare relatively poorly. And if we factor in that they've had few positive experiences, we might predict they would do even worse. But if we factor in that they've had adversity, but they have some positive experiences, they may actually fare relatively well. That's what Christina's data shows us, right? So the point, take home again, high adversity does not mean that you're broken or doomed, right? But unfortunately, the converse is true as well. Low adversity does not mean that you're in the clear. And just as an example of that, just look at the kids that committed Columbine, right? They were not kids you would necessarily expect having significant adversity, right? So if we take a kid who has a relatively low ACE score, we might say, well, hey, that kid should do pretty well. And if we factor in that they have some positive experiences, we might predict they would do even better. But if we remember that there are some kids that may not have a lot of adversity, but they don't have those positive experiences, they may actually fare relatively poorly. Again, Christina's data bears that out. So the point is that adversity and positive experiences, they coexist in the lives of children every day. So you may have a really nurturing teacher, but you may also have a bully. But if we're only looking at the bully and not having a nurturing teacher, we're not getting a complete picture of what's going on. So going back to what I talked about before, what's inside the proverbial black box? We would say that on the adverse side of things, we have toxic stress, right? That leads to epigenetic changes in brain connectivity, and behavioral allostasis. On the converse side, though, we know that if there's relational health, those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, that can lead to social emotional learning and healthy adaptations and healthy outcomes. But we also know that preventing adversity and toxic stress is not enough. Christina Bethel's data shows us that it's not enough just to prevent the bad. We also need to be baking in some good, right? And we must promote the relational health and those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And so then the question, of course, is how, right? How do we go about doing that, right? I mean, I think we can agree that's sort of why we're all here, is that how can we promote compassion? How can we build relational health? How can we sort of change policies and the way we think about things to raise the next generation to have more positive outcomes and fewer negative outcomes? Well, I don't have a complete answer, although I have a whole nother talk that I'll give the next time, just beginning to go into the weeds of how we do that. But I think it begins by acknowledging that you never change things by fighting the existing reality. This is a quote from Buckminster Fuller. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that sounds great. But when you think about it, it's really hard to pivot from deficit-based models to strengths-based models. And I had a little symbol here for medicine, because if you stop and think about it, medicine is really a very deficits-based model. Just forgive me for a second. Forgive me, I'm starting to lose my voice. Yeah, medicine is really a deficits-based model. If you think about it, as physicians, Dr. Barker and I will tell you that we get paid on the basis of what's wrong with you, your diagnosis, and what we've done to you, the procedural codes. So a diagnosis code and a procedural code, what's wrong with you and what we've done for you, is the entire basis of the healthcare system. It's all deficits. We need to pivot from a deficits model to a strengths-based model. How do we actually build relationships, build compassion? I think, again, it starts really early, and it starts with us making sure that we're partnering with caregivers and making it easier for parents to do what's sort of biologically programmed to do. We put up barrier after barrier and make it harder and harder. And again, the vicious cycle of violence, hurt people. So that's going to be my next talk. How do we really get into promoting relational health? But to summarize today's talk, we need to move beyond toxic stress towards relational health, right? Toxic stress defines the problem. Toxic stress explains how many of our society's most intractable problems, disparities in health and education and economic stability, they're rooted in our shared biology, but divergent experiences and opportunities. Relational health, on the other hand, defines the solution, explains how individual, family, and community capacities that support those safe, stable, nurturing relationships and positive childhood experiences, they buffer adversity and they build resilience across the life course. So to just sort of summarize here, and I apologize for brutally paraphrasing Frederick Douglass here, it's easier to help the caregivers as they build strong children than to prepare broken men and women. And so I'm grateful for your opportunity to be here. It looks like we have lots of time for questions, and I would be happy to answer them as best that I can.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Garner, for that excellent presentation. Leaves much to think about. And so I would just open it up for folks to ask you questions. I, of course, have 1,000 in my own mind, but first, let's hear from others.
I'm always nervous when there are no questions because it either means that I completely befuddled everybody or they're too afraid to ask a question, but please fire away. I'm happy to, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I'm happy to give a shot.
There's a question in the chat. Does this relate to polyvagal theory?
Absolutely. I love it. Yeah. So polyvagal theory and Porges. I mean, I wasn't gonna get too much into the weeds there, but yeah. So, I mean, when we talked about toxic stress, I was just talking briefly about how there are mediators of the stress response with cortisol and epinephrine, and those are mediated by, we tend to think of the autonomic nervous system. These are things that happen automatically, and there's two parts to the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic, which is what triggers the fight or flight response and cortisol levels in the hypothalamic and pituitary axis, and then there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which sort of acts as the yin and yang. It turns things off, and the vagal nerve is a very strong suppressor of that stress response. And so, yeah, so when we do our meditation, when we started here with some deep breathing, we know that deep breathing stimulates the vagal nerve and turns off the stress response, right? So there's a reason that we do these things, but it's also a reason why something like eating a good meal turns off stress, because when you eat a meal, the vagal nerve gets activated, turns off the stress response. Man, that meal is good. Maybe I just need another meal and I'll feel better, right? And so, yeah, but the point is that the vagal nerve also does a lot of things we're starting in higher mammals and like in humans. It allows us to feel connection, and that's what the whole polyvagal thing is, restoring relationships. So I'm not an expert on polyvagal therapy, but absolutely the work of Stephen Porges is integral to understanding toxic stress and relational health.
Thank you. If others would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand or just jump in and ask.
So there's a question here about from Quebec about methylated, and I apologize, I didn't get into more of that. So let's talk just a little bit about what I mean by that. So DNA, as you know, you got those ACTG base pairs that come together in DNA, and it works like a zipper. So the DNA opens, and then it gets transcribed into RNA, and then translated into a protein. So that's the expression process. Turns out that those base pairs, they actually can be methylated. Some of them can put methylation marks. So methyl is a carbon atom that gets added, but when that happens, then it may make it harder to get transcribed, right? So and so there are some examples of it going the other way, but in general, if you methylate a piece of DNA, you make it harder for it to be transcribed and translated and turned into a protein. So methylation basically is turning off the expression of that gene. So if you methylate the fetal glucocorticoid receptor, you are turning off the way that gene is expressed. So you're going to have fewer receptors for the glucocorticoids, which in turn, again, can make it harder to turn off the stress response. So that's what I meant by methylation. There are other forms of epigenetic regulation as well. So that's just one. So you can also use acetyl groups. There also are changes in DNA structure that can happen. There are changes that we think happen in terms of how the telomeres at the end of DNA work. So the point is that methylation, epigenetics refers to changes in expression without changing the DNA sequence. We're not changing the sequence of CATGs, but we're methylating some of them and changing the ability of that gene to get turned on. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah, and war-torn areas. Wow. Yeah, so I'm not aware of that data, but I would be shocked if someone hasn't looked at it in terms of epigenetics in war-torn places. I mean, if they haven't, it should be, but I'm not aware of that data. I would be shocked if that's not the case. I'm sorry, I just don't know that. Feel free to unmute and ask questions if you'd like.
Hi, I'll ask a quick question. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I feel like it's everything up my alley and what I spend a lot of my days talking about. So it's just such a pleasure. So something that I've been trying to discern is whether or not our relationships, what I tend to call intimate relationships, but those kind of safe, stable, nurturing relationships, are currently decreasing or at kind of all-time lows. And the reason I'm wondering about this is just due to the current mental health crisis, as well as just physical health that we have going on. And it's my belief that societally and culturally, we are at somewhat of an all-time low based on the current structuring of our relationships, the ways that we're interacting. We're no longer living in, close-knit societies. But I'm curious as to your thoughts on this.
Absolutely. I would totally agree with that. I mean, I think that what we're seeing right now is the perfect storm of multiple factors, but certainly losing the extended family is just one example, right? So, we used to grow up in sort of not kibbutzes, but neighborhoods where the aunt and uncle were down the street and you had lots of connection and this is probably more than you need to know. And we'll get into this a little bit in the second lecture, but there's this idea of biobehavioral synchrony. So this is a way of sort of measuring this intimacy, that when you are connected with someone, and we all know those mojo of magic where I'm understood, I feel seen, and I understand them, and we've got something going here. There actually is a biological correlate to that called biobehavioral synchrony. And the thing that's interesting is that that's what kids are looking for. That's what we're looking for. And we can't always be in sync with the same person, which is why there is data out there that it doesn't really matter about the gender or sexual orientation of the parents. But if you have more than one, kids are going to tend to do better because you can't always be in sync. That's just life. You can't always be in sync. But the more people that you have around that you can be in sync with, well, I'm not in sync. Now I'm in sync with this one. Now I'm in sync with this one. Now I'm in sync with that one. I'm in sync with all these people, but you've lost the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents, all that surrounded you. And so you're feeling more and more isolated. So yes, I think socially we are at an all-time low. Some of that is partially from social media, and we would do things on social media we would never do face-to-face to someone. To see the look of horror and pain in someone's face, it's a lot easier to send them an email, right? But you would never say that to their face because you have to see the pain in their face. And then even kids are isolated because part of the pandemic, which didn't help things, but also, again, video game manufacturers are smart. They make video games in a specific way for a specific reason. I love this. There's a theory out there called self-determination theory, right? Which holds that there's external motivators and there's internal motivators, and the things that motivate the internal motivation are autonomy, connection, and competence, right? And so the video game manufacturers, they tap into because they know it's going to make your parents crazy. So that's autonomy. I'm doing it because I want to. It also competence, lots of ding ding bells and whistles and coins. Look how good I am. And then if you can do Minecraft with your friends, that's a kind of social connection. And so kids get addicted to it, but it's not really social connection. It's not that biobehavioral synchrony that we're talking about and what you're talking about intimate relationships of being seen and heard. So yes, that's part of the reason that myself and our colleagues, when we were revising the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement on toxic stress, wanted to pivot away from toxic stress and shine a bright light on social isolation. There's actually a section in the policy statement that talks about the role and toll of social isolation. And I think that's what you're getting at. So yes, I think we are more socially isolated than we ever have been. And some of it's pandemic, some of it's electronic media, and some of it is just that we've gotten into this sort of sense, and the kids are feeling it. It's the sense that other people's kids are not my problem. You know what I mean? That's sort of, whereas, wow, there are human capital, there are next generation. And so, but yes, I'd like to give a more optimistic assessment. But yeah, I think right now things are pretty bleak. But the optimistic side of it is, I think we know the answer. I think that disparities in education and economics and all these intractable problems, you really, I think in my mind, can trace back to that social isolation, to that lack of being connected, to that lack of awareness that we're all connected. But by the grace of God, there go I, And so I think that hopefully that if we have economists telling us we need to invest in families, and we have biologists saying we need to invest in families, and we have the ethical and moral community saying we need to invest in families, hopefully we can build a coalition of families and change things around. But I thank you for your question. I hope I answered it.
There's a comment made by Yafa Moritz that Rachel Yehuda, I think it's pronounced, does lots of research on epigenetic and war-related trauma. Just wondering, Yafa, if you'd have a few more comments on that.
You asking her? I hope so. I lived them too. So
yeah, I think you're muted, Yafa.
Do you know her work?
I do not. I've heard her name before for sure, but I can't think of a specific.
There is a lot of research. She did a lot. She started with Holocaust survivors and she I think she brought this whole epigenetic and trauma relation of mental health to our awareness for a long time ago. So years of research about war areas and the trauma and epigenetics. So you can see her work everywhere. And if you just Google up.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I had a feeling it had been done. I just wasn't sure who had done it.
Yes, I know. But also it's like she's looking not on the second generation, but the third generation of people who grew up in trauma and how it really expresses in your body.
Right. Well, that's it. And so we started getting this idea of historical trauma and how we address that. Right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Yafa. There's a book that I'm sure many on this call have read, and you probably have too, Dr. Garner. Dr. Cole's book on The Body Keeps the Score. Yeah. And I'm just intrigued. I know that your next talk will probably go into, okay, how to address the toxic stress. And where does it start? Where should it start? And how can it start at the earliest phases of life, even in that prenatal area? So any comments on The Body Keeps the Score, Dr. Garner?
Not a lot. I mean, it's been a while since I've read it. I mean, I think that sort of that would probably be the take-home message from this talk, right? But I think that moving forward, there's, and I think it's becoming more mainstream now, right? So Ian Oprah and Bruce Perry wrote a book called, and it just recently fell off, I guess, the New York Times bestseller, What Happened to You, right? And so that's sort of getting into this whole idea of trauma-informed care, that it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. Bruce Perry is a psychiatrist in Texas who has this neurosequential model, and I'll talk a little bit about it in the talk the next time, where it really is based upon the way the brain functions, that you have the amygdala, and then you have the prefrontal cortex. And so he talks about regulate, relate, and then reason, right? And so unless we are regulated ourselves, we're not going to be able to relate to others. And unless we're able to relate to someone, we're really not engaging the prefrontal cortex and learning new skills. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I think that's one way to think about how we move forward. In the next talk, I'm going to basically talk about 3 lenses, because I don't really have all the solutions, but I think one clearly is, this is too generational, right? So, people that think that, we're going to solve this by, I have lots of empathy for the kids, but the parents they made their bed, they need to lie in it. Well, that's not going to help us any. You're shooting your nose to spite your face or whatever. We're not helping if we're not going to do that. So I think that one is, it needs to clearly be too generational. The second is that it really is about affect regulation. That's where that starts. being aware of your emotions, being where someone else is affecting you. Because again, I think it's always hard to really have compassion when you're in survival mode, ourselves, I mean, compassion is something we all strive for. But I think it's fair to always say we're not perfect at it. We all have our triggers, and a lot of times those triggers are things that have happened to us in the past, things that are triggering something in the past, and we say things without meaning it. So we have to be able to regulate and then relate, and then we're in a position where we can actually build those skills and build that resilience and those foundations for affect regulation in the next generation. So needs to be 2-generational. There needs to be an emphasis on affect regulation, and then it needs to be a public health approach. And I think that's something I'll talk about a lot in the next talk, is that as a society, I think we're always looking for that one magic bullet, not to use a violent analogy, but we're looking for the one obvious solution, as opposed to understanding that complex things get fixed through layers, right? And so we want to have universal things to support relational health. We want to, identify barriers to relational health, and then we need to repair relational health. And that's not something people want to hear. No, I want a magic bullet. I want a one fixed program. Yeah, but complex things like public health, use a public health approach with universal primary preventions, secondary target interventions, and tertiary treatments. And if we apply that same approach to toxic stress, we're actually applying that same approach to building relational health. And that's really what we want to try and do, I think.
I just want to kind of thank you so much for this talk. I heard you talk before, and I encouraged Charlie to kind of reach out to you. So you are talking about, of course, it's relational, right? So and you talked about it right now, and next time I think you'll talk more about it. And I think one of the complexity is that we like to kind of really take the child and try to fix the child somehow. But now you have to deal with a complex system, as you say, and parenting is one. I mean, because if it's about safe, nurturing relationship, how do you actually work with parents? It's not so much the child anymore, it's a kind of the system. And how do you support system in the community? You talked about it. I'm sure next time we'll talk more about it.
Yeah.
And that's a public health kind of like alert, is that we need to change something very fundamental in how we relate to each other in the society. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think, so Nadine Burke-Harris, who was the former Surgeon General of the great state of California, has said, this is a public health crisis, right? This is a public health crisis. And I think we need to approach it like a public health crisis. Yeah. So it is complicated. Yeah. So, I mean, I think as a pediatrician, I tend to think about dyads. I think about caregiver and child. But that dyad is influenced by the relational health that surrounds it in terms of the family,
right,
the neighborhood, in terms of society. Yes. But again, and so all these other factors influence relational health at dyadic level. But the good news, again, is that if we get that right, we're going to, in turn, over generations, impact the way out. So as those children grow, then there are going to be parents that can nurture that in their kids too. I think, and I don't have time to talk about this a lot, and even in the talk next time, but I think part of the problem is that and there's a lot of psychology that goes along with this, is the idea of a zero sum. You know what I mean? Like if I give something, well, then that's less that I have. And we're very much in a zero sum mentality right now. And there's a lot of economics and psychology that talks about when you're in a zero sum mode, you're in survival mode, you're not empathetic. And so I think we have to somehow break that. And that may then start getting towards changing that ecology. Being generous just with your gratitude. You know what I mean? For people that have helped you, it costs you nothing to say thank you. You know what I mean? It costs you nothing except awareness and attention. Yeah. If we start with that generosity of gratitude, then maybe we're going to be more generous with our gifts. Because if it's easy for you, it may be really hard for someone else, but you can help them. No big deal for you, but man, it's a great deal for them. So generous in your gifts, and then then the ultimate really is being generous in your graciousness, which is the hard one, because then that requires us to swallow our pride, right? And when someone's being mean, not to be mean back. And that's a whole nother level of thing. But yeah, I think that it's not going to be easy, but I think hopefully those different lenses, 2-generational, okay, I got it. I've been focused on kids, but if I'm not focusing on helping the parents and doing things like an earned a livable wage. I'm not focusing on transportation. I'm not focusing on food insecurity. Well, then I'm not really helping the kids. And then the, affect regulation, well, geez, then, saying we don't need social emotional learning in schools. I can't think of anything we need more now than social emotional learning in schools. I mean, just dead stop, drop the mic. Like that's like the most important thing we can do right now is help people understand that, yeah, it's okay to be scared and be frustrated and upset. It's part of being human. If you're not one of those right now, you're missing something. So that's okay. But then what do we do about it? And then again, the public health approach. I mean, hopefully that one of those lenses will hopefully resonate with people, and hopefully we can begin sort of building a coalition towards promoting things like the Charter for Compassion and seeing that that compassion is not a zero sum. And I think that's the take home, is that when you're in zero sum, you know what I mean? What about me? Why does it? No, compassion, it costs you little to do that, but it's going to come back to you multifold over. So yeah.
And it's trainable. That's the thing that is so wonderful. It's a skill that we can learn. Yeah.
Yes.
You said something on one of your talks that I distinctly remember, and it was so impactful. But before I mention that, you were talking about our changing attitude about trauma. What's wrong with you?
Right.
Punishment related thing to what happened to you, which is a step in the right direction to discover and to relate. But I think there's an attitude that takes us even another step forward, and that is what's right about you. What can we emphasize that's right about you? And you said something that was really significant, that a kid who's been through a lot of trauma, a lot of ACEs, and maybe some positive experiences as well, the most significant thing for that child to hear is from someone who is irrationally for that kid, irrationally loves that kid, despite everything. And so you want to comment on that? And I think that will be our final. We need to turn it over to Marilyn so she can tell us about the future. Okay, so thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. So that's a quote from Bronfenbrenner, who was one of the co-founders of Head Start.
Uh-oh.
I think he just froze.
I think he just froze. So hopefully he'll be back with us shortly.
Well, Charlie, why don't I just go ahead and I'll share my screen because I think there are some interesting things that are coming on that relate to the whole topic today. So this is the Ed Forum part of the offerings from the Charter for Compassion. And next time that we meet will be June 2nd, and it is the Respect Project. And we will be joined by Femke van der Ster, who is from the Netherlands. And this particular program is the Respect Classroom, but it also is an effort to take what happens within the context of a respectful classroom into the community. And so this particular program, while it started in the Netherlands, is also in practice in a number of countries in Africa. Then on June 6th, we come back and we have Dr. Garner again, completing this this dyad of presentations, Beyond Toxic Waste. And then on June 16th, we're going to go to Israel for Loving Classrooms. And it's a little misleading to say that they're only in Israel. David Gerfen is a person who has worked with this theory of loving classrooms, and they're very popular in the UK as well as in the Middle East and South Africa. And then on July 7th, we have Awakened Schools. And that is with Lisa Miller from Columbia University, who has written the book, The Awakening Brain and the Spiritual Child. And, you know, today's presentation also made me remember that we have a wonderful collaboration with Thomas Hubble and the Pocket Project and the Charter for Compassion with a course that is in 10 modules. It starts next week. So I believe it's on May 24th. Yes, and it goes until mid-September. It's really exciting. It's outlined session by session on the Charter website, and I'll put that link in the chat box so that you might easily go to it. So I think that Andrew is back with us.
Great.
I just admitted him.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. It looks like my computer froze. So I'm sorry if I missed some there.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for an outstanding presentation. Comments in the chat. You can see how much everyone appreciates your being here. And I don't know, I'd like to give you the last word before we say goodbye until June the 6th, when you'll return to us with even more wonderful information.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. I think it's very reassuring to see a group like this from all over the world that's interested in trying to promote relational health and compassion. I mean, I find that encouraging, and so I look forward to continuing our discussion in a couple of weeks.
Thank you very much. And for everyone, this will be recorded and will be available for everyone who's registered who'd like to go back and view it again. A lot to digest. Thanks again, Dr. Garner, and thank you all for participating in today's EdNet Forum. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.